The October wind cut through Jacob Thompson's worn flannel shirt like a blade, carrying with it the scent of dying corn and broken dreams. At 42, he moved with the heavy gait of a man who'd watched 3 consecutive harvests fail, each one taking another piece of his soul with it. The Thompson family farm in Cedar Valley, Iowa, had been in his bloodline for 4 generations, but Jacob was beginning to suspect he'd be the last. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His weathered hands gripped the rusted handle of the milk pail as he trudged toward the old red barn, the same barn his great-grandfather had built in 1889. The structure leaned slightly to the east now, its paint peeling like sunburned skin, but it remained standing, much like Jacob himself. Stubborn, his late wife Sarah used to say, stubborn as an old mule and twice as ornery. Sarah had been gone 2 years now, taken by cancer that ate through their savings faster than it ate through her body. The medical bills still arrived monthly, cruel reminders of a fight they'd lost, despite mortgaging everything they owned. Jacob's remaining livestock consisted of 3 aging cows, a handful of chickens that barely laid enough eggs to feed himself, and an arthritic horse named Chester, who was more pet than work animal at this point. The drought of 2019 had devastated most of Cedar Valley, but Jacob's farm had suffered worse than most. Poor soil management from previous years, outdated irrigation systems he couldn't afford to replace, and a series of unfortunate decisions had left his 200-acre property teetering on the edge of foreclosure. The bank had already sent 2 notices, each one more threatening than the last. As Jacob approached the barn, he mentally calculated his remaining options. Sell to Agricorp, the massive farming conglomerate that had been circling local properties like vultures, and walk away with enough money to rent a small apartment in town. Find work at the grain elevator or the feed store, jobs that would barely and cover his expenses but might preserve what little dignity he had left, or keep fighting a losing battle until the bank took everything anyway. The barn door hung askew on its hinges, creaking in the wind like an old rocking chair. Jacob had been meaning to fix it for months, but motivation was hard to come by when you weren't sure you'd own the place much longer. He pushed through the entrance, breathing in the familiar smell of hay, leather, and decades of honest work. The interior was dimly lit by shafts of afternoon sunlight streaming through gaps in the weathered boards. Jacob's few remaining tools hung on hooks along the walls, a pitchfork with a cracked handle, a shovel blade dulled by years of use, and various implements that had seen better decades. The hayloft overhead held maybe 24 bales, barely enough to feed his animals through the winter, assuming he could afford to keep them. As he moved toward the milk stalls, Jacob's thoughts drifted to happier times. He remembered helping his father with morning chores when he was 8 years old, standing on a wooden crate to reach the cow's udders while his dad patiently corrected his technique. He remembered bringing Sarah here during their courtship, showing off the farm that would someday be theirs, painting pictures of the children they'd raise among the cornfields and pastures. Those children had never come. 3 miscarriages had broken Sarah's heart and strained their marriage, though they'd eventually found their way back to each other. They'd talked about adoption, but the farm's financial struggles had made that dream impossible. Now at 42 and alone, Jacob wondered if he'd missed his chance at the family he'd always wanted. The sound of movement from the hayloft froze him in place. Not the scratching of mice or the flutter of barn swallows, but something larger, human-sized. Jacob's hand instinctively moved to the shotgun he kept mounted near the door, though he hesitated to reach for it. Times were hard, and desperate people sometimes did desperate things, but Jacob wasn't the type to shoot first and ask questions later. "Hello!" he called out, his voice echoing in the barn's emptiness. "Someone up there?" The movement stopped. Immediately, followed by a silence so complete that Jacob wondered if he'd imagined the whole thing. Then, barely audible, came the sound of a woman's voice, weak and frightened. "Please," the voice whispered, "please don't hurt us." Jacob's heart hammered in his chest as he looked up toward the loft. The ladder rungs were old and unreliable, but he climbed carefully, each step announcing his approach with groans of protest from the aged wood. As his head cleared the loft floor, he found himself face to face with a scene that would be burned into his memory forever. Huddled in the far corner, surrounded by loose hay and covered with a tattered blanket, was a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25. Her blonde hair hung in matted strands around a face that was gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. Dark circles ringed her blue eyes, and her clothes, a faded sundress that had seen much better days, hung loose on her skeletal frame. But it wasn't the woman's condition that stopped Jacob's breath. It was the three small figures pressed against her sides, children who looked to be around 3 years old, identical in their pale, pinched faces and enormous dark eyes. Triplets, all girls, from what Jacob could tell, all desperately thin, all staring at him with a mixture of fear and hope that cut straight through his chest. "Ma'am," Jacob said softly, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. "Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" The woman's arms tightened protectively around her children. "We're sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We didn't mean to trespass. We'll leave. We'll go right now." She tried to stand, but her legs gave out immediately, and she collapsed back into the hay with a small cry of distress. The children, apparently accustomed to their mother's weakness, clustered closer to her, their small hands patting her arms and shoulders in gestures of comfort that broke Jacob's heart. "Whoa, easy there," Jacob said, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "You're not going anywhere in that condition. When's the last time you ate something?" The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head as if the question was too painful to answer. One of the little girls, braver than her sisters, looked up at Jacob with serious dark eyes. "Mama's tummy hurts," she said in a clear, sweet voice. "Our tummies hurt too. We're very hungry, mister." Jacob felt something twist in his chest, a pain that was part anger and part protective instinct. These weren't vagrant criminals taking advantage of his hospitality. This was a mother with 3 babies, all of them clearly starving, who had sought shelter in his barn because they had nowhere else to go. "What's your name?" Jacob asked the woman, settling himself on a hay bale to appear less intimidating. "Rebecca," she whispered. "Rebecca Martinez. These are my daughters, Elena, Sophia, and Maria." Jacob nodded to each of the girls in turn, noting how they stayed close to their mother, but watched him with obvious curiosity. "I'm Jacob Thompson. This is my farm, my barn. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need." Rebecca's eyes widened, in disbelief. "We can't pay you. We don't have any money. We've been living in our car for 2 weeks, but it broke down outside of town and we had to walk. The girls were so tired, and when we saw your barn—" "How long since you've eaten?" Jacob interrupted gently. Rebecca's face crumpled. "The girls had some crackers yesterday morning. I gave them the last of what we had." "And you?" 3 days, she admitted, her voice breaking. "Maybe 4. I lose track." Jacob stood up slowly, his mind already working through logistics. "Rebecca, I'm going to go to the house and get some food. Basic stuff. Bread, milk, maybe some soup. Will you be okay here for a few minutes?" "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," Jacob said firmly. "I've got plenty and you've got nothing. That makes this pretty simple." As he climbed back down the ladder, Jacob's thoughts raced. 4 people, 3 of them children, who hadn't eaten in days. A young mother who looked like she was about to collapse from malnutrition and exhaustion. And here he was, a lonely farmer with a pantry full of food and no one to share it with. The walk to the farmhouse took only 2 minutes, but it gave Jacob time to think. Rebecca Martinez, the name suggested Hispanic heritage, though her accent was purely Midwestern. The girls looked healthy aside from their obvious hunger, suggesting Rebecca had been caring for them as best she could under impossible circumstances. Their clothes were dirty but not ragged. Their hair was tangled but clean. This wasn't long-term homelessness. This was recent desperation. The farmhouse kitchen, like everything else on the property, showed signs of neglect and economic hardship. The appliances were 30 years old. The linoleum was cracked, and the cabinets needed repainting. But the pantry was reasonably well stocked. Jacob had always been a good provider, even when he was only providing for himself. He gathered supplies. Quickly, a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, a gallon of milk, a can of chicken soup and some crackers. Not gourmet fare, but nutritious and easy on stomachs that had been empty too long. He also grabbed a thermos of coffee he'd made that morning and a first aid kit, just in case. The trip back to the barn felt longer than the trip away from it. Jacob found himself wondering about Rebecca's story, about how a young mother with 3 children ended up sleeping in a stranger's hayloft. Iowa wasn't exactly a destination for refugees or migrants. People came to Cedar Valley to work in agriculture or to raise families in small-town America. They didn't usually arrive on foot with nothing but the clothes on their backs. When he climbed back into the loft, he found the family exactly as he'd left them, huddled together in their corner. But now all 4 pairs of eyes tracked his movement, hope and hunger warring in their expressions. "Okay," Jacob said, settling the food beside them. "Let's start slow, soup first, then bread. When you've been without food for a while, you need to be careful not to eat too much too fast." He opened the can and poured soup into the thermos cap, blowing on it to cool it down before offering it to Rebecca. She took a tentative sip, then another, her eyes closing in apparent relief. The girls watched every movement, and Jacob could practically hear their stomachs growling. "Can they have some?" Rebecca asked, gesturing toward her daughters. "Of course, but small amounts at first." Jacob watched as Rebecca carefully fed each girl a few spoonfuls of soup, her own hunger clearly secondary to theirs. It was a display of maternal sacrifice that reminded him powerfully of his own mother, who had often gone without so her children could have enough. As the family ate, Jacob found himself studying them more carefully. The girls were clearly identical triplets, probably around 3 years old, with dark hair and enormous brown eyes that dominated their thin faces. They were well-behaved, taking turns without fighting, saying thank you in small voices after each spoonful. Rebecca had raised them with manners and consideration, despite whatever circumstances had brought them to his barn. "Rebecca," Jacob said carefully, not wanting to pry, but needing to understand their situation. "Where are you folks from? Where were you headed?" Rebecca paused in feeding Maria, her youngest by perhaps minutes. "We're from Minneapolis originally. We've been trying to get to my sister in Kansas City. She said she could help us get back on our feet. That's a long way from here. The car broke down outside Cedar Valley. The mechanic said it would cost $800 to fix, and we had maybe $30 between us." Rebecca's voice was matter-of-fact, but Jacob could hear the exhaustion underneath. "We started walking south, following the highway. The girls got tired, and when we saw your barn..." Jacob nodded, pieces of the story falling into place. "What happened in Minneapolis, if you don't mind me asking?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her hand smoothing Elena's hair as the little girl dozed against her shoulder. "My husband died in a construction accident 6 months ago. No life insurance, no savings. The medical bills from his time in the hospital wiped out everything. We lost our apartment 2 months ago." The simple, devastating explanation hit Jacob like a physical blow. Here was a woman who'd lost everything: husband, home, security, and was trying to rebuild with 3 small children depending on her. The magnitude of her situation made his own problems seem manageable by comparison. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. That's a hell of a thing to go through. Miguel was a good man, Rebecca said, her voice steady but sad. He worked hard, loved. His girls always said he'd take care of us, but life doesn't always work out the way you plan. Jacob knew something about that. He'd planned to raise children in this barn, to pass the farm down to the next generation, to build something lasting with Sarah by his side. Instead, he was a widower facing foreclosure, eating dinner alone every night and wondering what the point of it all was. But looking at Rebecca and her daughters, he felt something stirring that he hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. These 4 people needed help, and he was in a position to provide it. Maybe his circumstances weren't as dire as he'd thought. Maybe having something to give was more important than everything he'd lost. As the sun began to set outside the barn, painting the interior in shades of gold and amber, Jacob made a decision that would change all their lives. He couldn't fix Rebecca's tragedy or bring back her husband. He couldn't guarantee that his own farm would survive the winter. But he could make sure 4 people had food tonight, and shelter, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to start over. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "I've got a proposition for you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca's eyes searched Jacob's face, wariness mixing with desperate hope. In her experience, men who made propositions to vulnerable women with children rarely had pure intentions. She'd learned to read the signs during their weeks of homelessness, the lingering looks, the false kindness that came with unspoken expectations. But Jacob Thompson's weathered features held nothing predatory. His blue eyes, faded like old denim, carried the weight of his own losses. When he spoke, his voice was steady and businesslike, as if he were discussing crop rotations rather than changing 4 lives forever. "I need help running this farm," Jacob continued, settling more comfortably on the hay bale. "It's a 200-acre operation that used to employ 6 seasonal workers. Now it's just me, and I'm drowning. The harvest is rotting in the fields because I can't afford to hire help, and I can't do it all myself." Rebecca shifted Maria to her other arm, the little girl having fallen asleep against her shoulder. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't know anything about farming. I worked in an office before the girls were born, data entry and filing. Miguel handled all the manual labor in our family." "I'm not talking about field work," Jacob said quickly, "though if you're willing to learn, I'd teach you. What I'm talking about is partnership. You help me save this harvest, help me get through the winter, and I'll provide housing, food, and a chance for you and the girls to get back on your feet." The word partnership hung in the air between them. Rebecca had heard it before, usually from men who meant something entirely different. "What kind of partnership?" she asked carefully. Jacob seemed to understand her caution. "The kind where you keep your own bedroom, make your own decisions, and get a fair share of whatever profit we manage to generate. The farmhouse has 4 bedrooms. You and the girls would have your own space, your own privacy. I'm not looking for a wife or a mother for children I don't have. I'm looking for someone who needs a fresh start as much as I need reliable help." Elena stirred against Rebecca's side, mumbling something in Spanish that Jacob didn't understand but recognized as the language of dreams. The sound seemed to remind Rebecca of everything she was fighting for. "I'd need to know more details," she said slowly, "about the work, about the living arrangements, about what happens when spring comes." Jacob nodded, appreciating her practical approach. "Fair enough. Let me show you around tomorrow, let you see what you'd be getting into. Tonight, though, let's get you and the girls fed properly and settled somewhere more comfortable than a hay loft." "We can't impose on your hospitality," Rebecca began, but Jacob held up a weathered hand. "Rebecca, 6 months ago my wife died of cancer. Before that, we lost 3 babies that we wanted more than anything in the world. This house has been quieter than a tomb ever since. Having voices in it again, especially children's voices, wouldn't be an imposition. It would be a gift. The raw honesty in his admissions struck Rebecca like a physical blow. Here was a man who'd lost as much as she had, maybe more. A man who understood that sometimes salvation came in unexpected packages. The girls can be loud, she warned. They're 3 years old, and they've been cooped up in small spaces for weeks. Once they feel safe, they're going to run around and make noise and probably break things. For the first time since Rebecca had met him, Jacob Thompson smiled. It transformed his entire face, erasing years of grief and worry. "Lady, I've been listening to nothing but my own thoughts for months. A little chaos might be exactly what this place needs." The walk from the barn to the farmhouse was a journey of revelation for both adults. Rebecca saw the property through the eyes of someone who'd lost everything material and learned to value shelter above luxury. The house was modest but solid, a 2-story white clapboard structure with a wraparound porch and mature oak trees that would provide blessed shade in summer. The yard needed work, but it was spacious enough for children to play safely, far from the dangers of city streets. Jacob saw his home through Rebecca's eyes and felt embarrassed by its neglect. The porch steps creaked, the paint was peeling, and the gardens Sarah had lovingly tended were now overgrown with weeds. But Rebecca wasn't looking at the flaws. She was looking at the potential. The same way he'd learned to look at struggling calves that might grow into prize cattle. "It's beautiful," Rebecca said softly as they climbed the front steps. Sophia and Elena flanked her, their small hands gripping her dress, while Maria remained asleep in her arms. "It needs work," Jacob admitted, fumbling with the front door key. "I haven't been much of a housekeeper since Sarah passed." The interior of the farmhouse told the story of a man who'd stopped caring about his surroundings. The living room was clean but stark, devoid of the feminine touches that had once made it warm and welcoming. Photographs of Jacob and a pretty brunette woman lined the mantelpiece, but they were dusty and seemed more like memorials than memories. Rebecca noticed everything. The hardwood floors that would be gorgeous with proper care, the stone fireplace that could warm the entire downstairs, the large windows that let in abundant natural light. She also noticed what was missing: curtains, plants, any sign that someone lived here rather than merely existed. "The bedrooms are upstairs," Jacob said, leading them up a staircase that was solid despite its age. "Master bedroom is mine, obviously. There's a guest room with a double bed and 2 smaller rooms that used to be intended for children." The children's rooms hit Rebecca like an emotional freight train. One was painted pale yellow with white trim, clearly prepared for a baby that never came. The other was done in soft green, with a rocking chair positioned near the window and a handmade quilt folded neatly on the single bed. Both rooms felt like shrines to dreams that never materialized. "Sarah decorated these," Jacob said quietly, noting Rebecca's expression. "We kept thinking, hoping, but it wasn't meant to be." "I'm sorry," Rebecca whispered, understanding with painful clarity what these empty rooms represented. Elena had awakened during the climb upstairs and was now looking around with wide eyes. "Mama, is this where we're going to live?" Rebecca looked at Jacob, who nodded encouragingly. "For a while, Mija. If Mr. Thompson doesn't mind sharing his house with 3 little girls who sometimes forget to use their inside voices." "Can we see our room?" Sophia asked, her natural boldness overcoming her earlier shyness. Jacob opened the door to the larger of the 2 children's rooms. "This one has bunk beds," he said, "and the other has a single bed. We could move things around, however." "Works best." The girls' excitement was infectious. They ran from room to room, chattering in a mixture of English and Spanish, their voices echoing through the house in a way that made Jacob's chest tight with unexpected emotion. For the first time in months, the Thompson farmhouse sounded like a home. They love it, Rebecca observed, watching her daughters explore with the enthusiasm of children who'd been confined too long. So do I, Jacob admitted. I'd forgotten what it sounded like when this place was alive. That evening, Jacob prepared the first real meal any of them had enjoyed in weeks. Nothing fancy, grilled cheese sandwiches, tomato soup from a can, and milk that was fresh from his own cows, but it might as well have been a feast. The girls sat at the kitchen table with proper plates and napkins, their manners impeccable despite their obvious hunger. "They're well behaved," Jacob commented, as he watched Elena carefully cut her sandwich into small pieces. "Miguel insisted on it," Rebecca said, her voice carrying both pride and sadness. "He said manners were free, and nobody could take them away from you, no matter how little money you had." As they ate, Jacob learned more about the family he'd invited into his home. Rebecca had met Miguel Martinez at the community college, where she was studying business administration. He was 7 years older, a construction foreman with steady work and dreams of starting his own contracting company. They'd married after a year-long courtship and been blissfully happy until Rebecca's pregnancy proved complicated. "The doctors said triplets were a miracle," Rebecca explained, spooning soup for Maria. "But bed rest for 6 months meant I lost my job, and Miguel had to take time off when I was hospitalized. We burned through our savings before the girls were even born." Jacob found himself admiring this woman's resilience. She spoke about devastating financial and personal losses with matter-of-fact acceptance, focusing on solutions rather than dwelling on problems. It was a practical strength he recognized in the best farmers, people who dealt with droughts, floods, and failed crops by adapting rather than surrendering. "What was Miguel like?" Jacob asked, genuinely curious about the man who'd raised such well-mannered daughters and inspired such obvious devotion. Rebecca's face softened. Patient, kind. He used to sing to the girls in Spanish, old songs his grandmother taught him. He was building them a playhouse in our backyard before... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Before the accident," Jacob supplied gently, "a crane malfunctioned. He was trying to get his crew to safety when it collapsed." Rebecca's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she wiped Maria's chin. "The paramedics said he died. Instantly that he wouldn't have suffered. I don't know if that's true, or if they just tell families that to make them feel better." The kitchen fell quiet, except for the soft sounds of children eating and the distant lowing of cattle in the pasture. Jacob found himself thinking about Sarah's final weeks, how she'd fought the cancer with everything she had until the very end. Different losses, but the same aftermath, a life completely rearranged around the absence of someone essential. "How old are the girls exactly?" Jacob asked, changing the subject to something less painful. 3 years and 4 months, Rebecca replied. "Elena was born first, then Sophia 2 minutes later, then Maria 3 minutes after that. Elena thinks being the oldest makes her the boss." As if summoned by her name, Elena looked up from her sandwich. "Mr. Jacob, do you have any animals?" "We saw cows from the window." "I do have cows," Jacob confirmed, "and chickens, and an old horse named Chester who's too lazy to do much work anymore." "Can we see them tomorrow?" Sophia asked eagerly. "If your mama says it's okay." 3 pairs of dark eyes turned to Rebecca expectantly. She looked at Jacob, who nodded encouragingly. "We'll see," she said, which in mother speak clearly meant yes. After dinner, Jacob showed Rebecca how the house operated, where the spare linens were kept, how to work the temperamental hot water heater, which windows stuck and which doors had tricks to opening them. It was domestic information that assumed permanence, though neither of them acknowledged that assumption directly. "There's a washer and dryer in the basement," Jacob mentioned. "Feel free to do laundry whenever you need to. And the pantry is stocked with basics. Help yourself to whatever you and the girls need." Rebecca stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her daughters chase each other around the living room in an impromptu game of tag. For the first time in months, they looked like normal children instead of tiny refugees. The transformation was remarkable and heartbreaking in equal measure. "Jacob," she said quietly, "I need you to understand something. I'm not looking for charity. If we stay here, I want to earn our keep. I want to contribute something real to this operation. What did you have in mind? I don't know yet. But I'm good with numbers, good with organization, good with people when I need to be. There has to be something I can do besides just taking up space." Jacob studied her profile as she watched her children play. Rebecca Martinez was clearly a woman who'd never been given anything for free, who'd worked for everything she'd ever had. The idea of accepting help without giving something back was foreign to her nature. "Tell you what," he said, "tomorrow I'll show you the books, let you see the financial situation. Maybe you can spot something I'm missing. Fresh eyes sometimes see solutions that experience overlooks." It was a generous offer that acknowledged her intelligence while giving her the dignity of contributing to their mutual survival. Rebecca turned to look at him, and for the first time since he'd found her in the barn, she smiled. "Thank you," she said simply, "for all of this. I know you didn't have to help us." "Maybe not," Jacob agreed. "But maybe helping you is helping me too. Maybe we're both getting something we need out of this arrangement." As the evening wound down and the girls began showing signs of exhaustion, Rebecca prepared them for bed, in rooms that felt impossibly luxurious after weeks of sleeping in cars and public restrooms. Jacob retreated to his own room, giving the family privacy while trying to process the magnitude of what he'd committed to. 4 people were now depending on him for shelter, food, and security. 3 children who would need stability, education, and emotional support as they grew up. A woman who'd lost everything and was trusting him with her family's future. It should have terrified him. Instead, as he listened to the soft sounds of a family settling in for the night, Jacob Thompson felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's diagnosis: hope for tomorrow. Dawn came earlier than Rebecca remembered from her city life, announced not by alarm clocks, but by the enthusiastic crowing of Jacob's rooster and the gentle lowing of cattle eager for their morning feed. She woke to the unfamiliar luxury of clean sheets and a real mattress, momentarily disoriented by the absence of road noise and police sirens that had punctuated their weeks of homelessness. The girls were still sleeping deeply, exhausted by the previous day's emotional and physical upheaval. Maria had claimed the middle of the double bed, her small arms spread wide as if to protect her territory, while Eleanor and Sophia flanked her like tiny guardians. Rebecca slipped out quietly, determined to prove her worth before Jacob could question his impulsive generosity. The farmhouse kitchen was empty, but showed signs of early activity. A pot of coffee still warm on the counter, a plate of toast crumbs by the sink, and the lingering aroma of bacon. Through the window over the sink, Rebecca could see Jacob in the distance, moving between the barn and a large red machine she assumed was some kind of tractor. Even from a distance, his movement spoke of urgency and frustration. Rebecca poured herself coffee and stepped onto the back porch, breathing in air so clean it almost hurt her city-trained lungs. The Thompson farm stretched out before her like a painting, rolling fields that should have been golden with mature corn, but instead showed patches of brown and yellow that even her inexperienced eye recognized as signs of distress. "Mama?" Elena's voice called from upstairs, followed immediately by the sounds of her sisters waking. Rebecca climbed the stairs to find all 3 girls crowded at the bedroom window, pressing their faces against the glass as they watched Jacob work in the distance. "What's he doing?" Sophia asked, her breath fogging the window. "Farmer work," Maria announced with the confidence of a 3-year-old who'd learned a new concept. "He takes care of the animals." After getting the girls dressed and fed, Rebecca made a decision that would prove pivotal to their future on the farm. Instead of waiting for Jacob to return and outline her duties, she bundled the children in their jackets and walked out to find him, determined to understand exactly what she'd committed herself to. They found Jacob wrestling with the engine of an ancient combine harvester, his hands black with grease and his expression grim. The machine was clearly older than Rebecca herself, held together with what appeared to be determination and prayer. Jacob's colorful cursing stopped abruptly when he noticed his audience. "Morning," he said, wiping his hands on a rag that was already beyond salvation. "You're up early." "We wanted to see the farm," Rebecca said simply, "and I wanted to understand what I'm supposed to help you with." Jacob looked at the broken machine, then at the fields of dying corn, then at the small family watching him with expectant faces. The weight of his situation seemed to settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. "This old girl broke down yesterday," he said, patting the combine's rusted side. "She's the only way I can harvest the corn, and every day I can't get her running. It's money I'm losing. The grain elevator in town pays by moisture content, and every day the corn sits in the field. It dries out more and becomes worth less." Rebecca studied the machine with the analytical eye she'd once applied to office problems. How much less? At current moisture levels, maybe $800 a day. If we get rain, could be thousands more in spoilage. The numbers hit Rebecca like a physical blow. In her former life, $800 had been a significant but manageable expense. Now, having lived on the financial edge for months, she understood it represented the difference between keeping the farm and losing everything. What would it cost to fix? Jacob's laugh was bitter. "Repair shop quoted me $1,200 for parts and labor, money I don't have." Elena, who had been listening with the intense concentration only children could muster, tugged on Jacob's work shirt. "Mr. Jacob, are you sad because your big machine is broken?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern, seemed to crack something in Jacob's armor. He knelt down to Elena's level, his expression softening. "Yeah, sweetie, I am sad about that. This machine helps me do my job, and when it's broken, I can't take care of the farm properly." "My papa used to fix things," Elena said proudly. "Mama has his tools in our car." Rebecca felt her heart skip. In the chaos of losing their apartment and living out of their broken-down vehicle, she'd forgotten about Miguel's tool collection. He'd been meticulous about maintaining his equipment, and his tools had been among his most prized possessions. Elena's. "Right," Rebecca said slowly. "Miguel was a mechanic before he got into construction. He taught himself by working on old cars and farm equipment. His tools are still in our car." Jacob's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine hope. "What kind of tools?" "Complete mechanics set. Wrenches, diagnostic equipment, specialty tools for engines." Miguel could fix anything with an engine, and he always said farm equipment was just bigger versions of car engines. For the first time since Rebecca had met him, Jacob looked truly excited. "Where's your car?" "Broken down about 5 miles outside town. The mechanic at Pete's garage said it would cost more to fix than it was worth, so we left it there." "Pete." "Morrison," Jacob said, his tone suggesting some history. "He's honest enough, but he's not exactly generous with payment plans. Would he let us retrieve some personal items?" "I still have the keys," Rebecca said, patting her pocket, "and I paid him $50 to store it for a month while we figured out what to do." The trip to town became an adventure that none of them would forget. Jacob's pickup truck was only slightly newer than his combine, but it ran reliably and had enough room for the whole family. The girls were enchanted by the ride through Iowa farmland, pointing excitedly at other farms, livestock, and the occasional deer that bounded through distant fields. Pete's garage sat on the outskirts of Cedar Valley, a collection of metal buildings surrounded by the automotive graveyard that seemed to be a feature of every small-town repair shop. Pete Morrison himself was a large, bearded man in coveralls who regarded Jacob with obvious surprise. "Thompson," Pete said by way of greeting. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Pete," Jacob replied neutrally. "This is Rebecca Martinez. I believe she has a car stored here." Pete's eyes moved from Jacob to Rebecca to the three girls peeking out from behind their mother's legs. His expression shifted from businesslike to curious. "The blue Honda with the busted transmission." "That's the one," Rebecca confirmed. "I need to get some tools out of the trunk." "Tools?" Pete's eyebrows rose. "You're not planning to try fixing that thing yourself, are you? Transmission's completely shot." "The tools belong to my late husband," Rebecca explained patiently. "They're not for the car." Pete led them to a fenced area behind the main building where several dozen vehicles in various states of decay waited for either repair or salvage. Rebecca's Honda Civic looked almost pristine by comparison, though Jacob could see the oil stains beneath it that told the story of its mechanical failure. The trunk yielded treasures that made Jacob's pulse quicken. Miguel Martinez had indeed been a craftsman who respected his tools. Everything was organized in custom foam inserts, cleaned and maintained, and represented thousands of dollars worth of professional-grade equipment. Socket sets, specialized, wrenches, diagnostic computers, and items Jacob recognized as designed specifically for agricultural machinery. "Jesus," Pete breathed, looking over Jacob's shoulder. "This is professional-grade stuff. Your husband know what he was doing?" "He was the best mechanic in Minneapolis," Rebecca said quietly. "He could fix anything." Elena piped up from where she was examining a particularly impressive wrench. "Papa said tools were like magic wands, but only if you knew the right spells." The drive back to the farm was charged with an energy that had been absent that morning. Jacob found himself explaining the combine's problems in detail, while Rebecca listened with the focused attention of someone who'd spent years translating technical jargon for office managers who didn't understand the equipment their businesses depended on. Miguel always said the first rule of diagnosis was listening to what the machine was trying to tell you, Rebecca said as they unloaded the tools. "What exactly happens when you try to start it?" Jacob demonstrated the problem, and Rebecca listened not just to his explanation, but to the sounds the machine made during failed start attempts. She walked around the combine, running her hands over access panels and studying the engine compartment, with an intensity that reminded Jacob of a doctor examining a patient. "The fuel pump," she said finally. "Miguel had a truck that made exactly that sound. The fuel pump was dying, so it couldn't maintain pressure." "I thought it might be electrical," Jacob admitted. "Could be both. Miguel always said electrical problems usually showed other symptoms first. This sounds mechanical to me." What followed was an education for both adults. Rebecca had absorbed more technical knowledge from her husband than she'd realized, while Jacob's practical farming experience provided context for theoretical solutions. Working together, they traced the fuel system from tank to engine, identifying several potential points of failure. The girls, meanwhile, had appointed themselves official tool handlers and were taking their responsibilities seriously. Elena could distinguish between different socket sizes. Sophia had mastered the art of holding flashlights at exactly the right angle, and Maria's job was keeping track of the bolts and screws that seemed to multiply whenever adult hands removed them. "There," Rebecca said finally, pointing to a component that was clearly corroded beyond repair. "That's your problem. The fuel pump is shot, and this filter is completely clogged. No wonder it won't start." Jacob examined the failed parts with a mixture of relief and concern. "You're absolutely right, but replacement parts for this old girl aren't exactly sitting on shelves. I'll have to order them, and that takes time we don't have. Or," Rebecca said thoughtfully, "we could rebuild what's here. Miguel always said you could make almost anything work again if you understood how it was supposed to work in the first. In place, You know how to rebuild a fuel pump? I know how to follow Miguel's repair manuals. He kept everything, including technical documents for equipment he'd never even seen. If we can find specs for this model... Jacob's expression was shifting from skeptical to hopeful. There might be manuals in the barn. The previous owner kept paperwork for everything. The afternoon was spent in detective work that felt like archaeology. The barn's loft contained boxes of documentation dating back decades, including original manuals for the combine, maintenance logs, and parts diagrams that were worth their weight in gold. Rebecca spread the technical documents across the kitchen table like a general planning a campaign, while the girls colored quietly nearby. "Look at this," Rebecca said, pointing to a detailed diagram. "The fuel pump is actually 3 separate components. We might not be able to rebuild the whole thing, but we could probably get it running well enough to finish the harvest." Jacob leaned over her shoulder, studying the technical drawings. "You really think this could work?" Miguel used to say that machines wanted to run properly. Most of the time, they just needed someone to help them remember how. As evening approached, and the girls began showing signs of exhaustion, Rebecca and Jacob had developed a plan of attack that would have made Miguel proud. They would disassemble the fuel system completely, clean and rebuild what they could, and fabricate temporary solutions for parts too damaged to repair. "It might not be pretty," Rebecca warned as they closed the manuals for the night, "but it should get you through harvest season." Jacob looked at this woman, who'd appeared in his barn less than 48 hours ago, and now was offering to save his farm with her late husband's tools and her own determination. "Rebecca, if this works, you'll have earned a full partnership in anything this place produces, and if it doesn't work," Jacob smiled, feeling more optimistic than he had in months, "then we'll figure out something else, together." That night, as Rebecca tucked her daughters into beds that were becoming familiar, Elena asked the question that was on all their minds. "Mama, are we going to stay here forever?" Rebecca looked out the window at fields that might yet yield a harvest, at a farm that might yet survive another season. "I don't know, mija, but for now, this feels like home." And for the first time since Miguel's death, Rebecca Martinez allowed herself to believe that home might be more than just a temporary refuge. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor that would test the fragile partnership Rebecca and Jacob were building. Rebecca was elbow-deep in the combine's fuel system, her hands already stained with grease despite the early hour, when the sound of an expensive car engine cut through the morning air. Through the barn door, she watched a sleek black Mercedes pull into the farmyard, looking as out of place as a tuxedo at a barn dance. The man who emerged from the driver's seat was everything Jacob Thompson was not: polished, pressed, and radiating. The kind of confidence that came from never having doubted where his next meal would originate. Richard Blackwood, as he would soon introduce himself, represented Agricorp, the agricultural conglomerate that had been circling struggling farms throughout Cedar Valley like a well-dressed vulture. "Mr. Thompson," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a seasoned salesman, "I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit. I was in the neighborhood and thought this might be a good time to discuss our previous conversation." Jacob emerged from the farmhouse, his expression guarded. Rebecca could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands unconsciously clenched into fists. "This was clearly not a welcome visit, Mr. Blackwood," Jacob replied neutrally. "I thought I made our position clear the last time we spoke." "Positions can change," Blackwood said smoothly, his eyes taking in the broken machinery, the overgrown yards, and the obvious signs of financial strain, especially when circumstances become challenging. Rebecca continued working, but every nerve was attuned to the conversation happening 50 feet away. She'd encountered men like Blackwood in her previous life, corporate predators who specialized in exploiting desperation. They dress their aggression in helpful language and disguise their attacks as generous offers. I understand you're facing some equipment failures, Blackwood continued, pulling out a tablet and consulting what appeared to be detailed notes. That old combine of yours must be 30 years old at least. Expensive to maintain, unreliable, probably costs you more in downtime than it saves in labor. She runs fine when she's running, Jacob replied, but Rebecca could hear the defensiveness in his voice. Of course, of course. But Jacob, may I call you Jacob, running a modern agricultural operation with equipment that old is like trying to compete in Formula One with a Model T. It's admirable, but it's not practical. Rebecca felt her anger rising. This stranger was systematically dismantling Jacob's confidence, using facts and logic as weapons to weaken his resolve. She'd seen Miguel endure similar attacks from construction company executives who wanted to eliminate smaller competitors. The offer I discussed with you last month is still on the table, Blackwood continued. In fact, given current market conditions, I might be able to improve it slightly. Complete buyout, immediate cash settlement, and a 5-year management contract that would allow you to stay on your own land as our regional supervisor. It was a clever trap, Rebecca realized. They would give Jacob just enough money to feel like he'd won something, while ensuring he remained dependent on their continued goodwill. He would trade ownership for employment and call it a victory. I'm not interested in selling, Jacob said firmly. But Rebecca could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. I understand the emotional attachment, Blackwood said sympathetically. This land has been in your family for generations, but Jacob, sentiment doesn't pay bank loans, emotion doesn't fix broken equipment or compensate for failed harvests. The conversation was interrupted by Elena, who had wandered out of the farmhouse in search of her mother. The little girl stopped short when she saw the stranger, then walked purposefully toward the barn where Rebecca was working. "Mama," Elena said loudly enough to carry across the yard, "the big machine is starting to look much better. When will Papa's tools make it run again?" Rebecca's heart clenched at Elena's casual reference to Miguel as Papa, but she also recognized an opportunity. "Soon, mija. We're making good progress." Blackwood's attention had shifted to Rebecca and the girls, his expression revealing surprise and calculation in equal measure. He'd clearly done his research on Jacob's situation, but hadn't accounted for the presence of a family with apparent mechanical skills. "I wasn't aware you had hired additional help," Blackwood said to Jacob, but his eyes remained on Rebecca. "Rebecca Martinez," Jacob said, his voice gaining strength. "My new partner." The word partner hung in the air like a challenge. Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude toward Jacob for claiming their relationship so definitively, especially in front of someone who was clearly trying to undermine his confidence. "Partner," Blackwood repeated, his tone suggesting the word had an unpleasant taste. "And you're qualified to work on agricultural machinery, Ms. Martinez." Rebecca straightened up from the engine compartment, meeting Blackwood's condescending gaze directly. "My late husband was a master mechanic who specialized in heavy equipment. I learned enough from him to diagnose and repair most common failures." "I see." Blackwood's smile was patronizing. "Well, that's certainly ambitious. Though I should mention that liability insurance for agricultural operations can be quite complex when unlicensed individuals attempt mechanical repairs." It was a subtle threat wrapped in helpful advice, designed to plant seeds of doubt about Rebecca's contributions. She'd heard similar warnings from construction executives who wanted to eliminate Miguel's small contracting business. "Mr. Blackwood," Rebecca said pleasantly, "are you suggesting that property owners can't maintain their own equipment?" "Not at all. I'm simply pointing out that modern agricultural operations require professional-grade solutions. Home remedies, And amateur repairs, however well-intentioned, often create more problems than they solve. Sophia and Maria had joined Elena near the barn, and all three girls were watching the interaction with the intense focus children brought to adult conversations they sensed were important. Rebecca was acutely aware that her daughters were learning lessons about how to respond to bullies, about standing up for yourself when someone tried to make you feel small. "Well," Rebecca said, returning to her work on the fuel pump, "I guess we'll find out how amateur my skills are when this machine starts running again." Jacob moved closer to the barn, his body language clearly aligning him with Rebecca against the outside pressure. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your interest in our operation, but as I've told you before, the Thompson farm is not for sale." "Jacob, be realistic," Blackwood said, his helpful mask beginning to slip. "You're one bad season away from foreclosure. Your equipment is failing, your crops are dying in the field, and now you're trusting the future of a century-old operation to someone with no agricultural experience and 3 small children to distract her." The attack was personal and vicious, designed to exploit every insecurity Jacob might have about his decision to trust Rebecca. But instead of weakening Jacob's resolve, it seemed to crystallize something in his expression. "Mr. Blackwood," Jacob said quietly, "I think it's time for you to leave." "Jacob, don't make a decision based on pride that you'll regret when—" "Now," Jacob interrupted, his voice carrying an authority Rebecca hadn't heard before. "Get off my land." Blackwood's friendly facade cracked completely, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "This is a mistake, Thompson. When this little experiment fails, don't expect our offer to remain open indefinitely." The Mercedes departed, in a cloud of dust and diesel fumes, leaving behind a tension that seemed to electrify the morning air. Jacob stood watching until the car disappeared over the hill, his hands still clenched into fists. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," Jacob said finally. "Don't apologize," Rebecca replied, wiping her hands on a rag. "I've dealt with vultures like him before. They specialize in making people feel helpless." "He's not wrong about everything," Jacob admitted. "This is a big risk for all of us. If we can't get the harvest in, then we'll figure out something else," Rebecca said firmly. "But we're not giving up before we've even tried." Elena had been listening intently to the entire exchange. Now she walked over to Jacob and took his hand with the matter-of-fact comfort. "Only children could provide, Mr. Jacob," she said seriously. "That man was mean to you and Mama, but Papa always said mean people are just scared people who forgot how to be nice." The simple wisdom hit Jacob like a physical blow. This 3-year-old child, who had lost her father and her home, was offering comfort to a grown man who felt overwhelmed by his circumstances. "Your papa was a smart man," Jacob said gently. "Papa said when people try to make you feel small, you make yourself big by helping other people feel big too." Rebecca felt tears sting her eyes. Miguel's philosophy, filtered through their daughter's innocent understanding, had just provided exactly the perspective they all needed. The morning's work on the combine took on new urgency after Blackwood's visit. Rebecca approached the mechanical problems with the systematic intensity Miguel had taught her, while Jacob provided agricultural context and historical knowledge about the machine's quirks and capabilities. "This part is completely corroded," Rebecca said, holding up a component that was more rust than metal. "But look at this." She pointed to her technical manual. "The function is just to regulate pressure. We might be able to fabricate something that works temporarily." "Fabricate how?" Rebecca smiled, the expression transforming her grease-stained face. "Miguel always kept spare parts from different machines. He said you never knew when you'd need to make one thing work like another thing." The afternoon became an exercise in creative engineering that would have made Miguel proud. Using components from Jacob's collection of retired farm equipment, Rebecca began assembling a hybrid solution that combined functional parts from 3 different eras of agricultural technology. The girls appointed themselves official assistants, fetching tools, holding flashlights, and providing a running commentary that kept both adults entertained despite the pressure they were under. "Mama's making the big machine feel better," Maria announced to anyone who would listen. "Like when you give medicine to sick people?" Sophia asked. "Exactly like that," Rebecca confirmed. "Machines get sick too, and sometimes they need special medicine to make them feel better." Elena, ever the practical one, studied Rebecca's work with serious attention. "Will it make the machine happy again?" "I hope so, Mija. But sometimes, even when you try your hardest, things don't work the way you want them to." It was a gentle lesson in managing expectations, but also a promise that effort mattered regardless of outcome. Rebecca was teaching her daughters that you fought for what you believed in, even when victory wasn't guaranteed. As the sun began to set, Rebecca made the final connections that would determine whether days of work had been worthwhile or wasted. Jacob stood beside the combine's operator seat, his hand on the ignition, while Rebecca made last-minute adjustments to her improvised repairs. "Ready?" Jacob called out. "Ready," Rebecca confirmed, though her heart was hammering with anxiety. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a roar that echoed across the valley. The combine shuddered to life, its rebuilt fuel system delivering the steady flow of power that would make the difference between financial survival and catastrophic failure. Elena, Sophia, and Maria cheered as if their favorite team had just won the championship. Jacob's whoop of joy was nearly as loud as the engine itself. But Rebecca simply stood back and watched the machine she'd brought back from the dead, thinking about Miguel and the legacy of knowledge he'd passed down through her hands to this moment. "You did it," Jacob said, jumping down from the operators. "See, you actually did it. We did it," Rebecca corrected, "all of us together." That evening, as they sat on the farmhouse porch watching the stars emerge in the clear Iowa sky, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced since Miguel's death. Not just hope, but genuine optimism about the future. "Tomorrow we start harvesting," Jacob said, his voice carrying a satisfaction Rebecca hadn't heard before. "Tomorrow we start proving that Richard Blackwood was wrong about everything," Rebecca replied, and in the distance, the repaired combine sat ready to fulfill its purpose, a testament to the power of refusing to surrender when the odds seemed impossible. The harvest began at dawn on a Tuesday that would later be remembered as the day everything changed for the Thompson farm. Rebecca stood at the kitchen window, watching Jacob perform his pre-dawn equipment checks with the methodical precision of a pilot preparing for a crucial flight. The repaired combine sat in the morning mist like a mechanical dinosaur, powerful and primitive, but ready to prove its worth. The girls had insisted on waking up early to witness what Eleanor had dubbed the big machine's first day back at work. They pressed their faces against the window, their breath fogging the glass as they watched Jacob climb into the operator's cab. "Mama, will the machine remember how to work?" Maria asked, her voice carrying the concern of someone who understood that adult happiness often depended on mechanical reliability. "We'll find out together, Mija," Rebecca replied, though her own stomach was tight with anxiety. All their work, all their hope, came down to whether Miguel's tools and her determination had been enough to resurrect 30-year-old agricultural equipment. The combine's engine rumbled to life with a sound that seemed to shake the entire farm. Jacob gave them a thumbs up through the cab window, then engaged the harvesting mechanism. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a mechanical symphony that sounded like industrial music, the combine lurched forward into the first row of corn. "It's working!" Sophia shrieked, bouncing on her toes. "The big machine is eating the corn." Rebecca felt tears of relief spring to her eyes as she watched stalks of corn disappear into the combine's header, only to emerge seconds later as clean grain flowing into the storage tank. After days of uncertainty and backbreaking work, the impossible had become reality. The first hour of harvesting revealed both the success of their repairs and the magnitude of the challenge ahead. The combine was working, but it was working slowly. What should have been a straightforward operation was complicated by the machine's age, the condition of the crop, and Jacob's need to baby the equipment to prevent another breakdown. At this rate, Rebecca calculated, watching Jacob's careful progress through the field, it's going to take 3 weeks to harvest everything. The problem wasn't just time, it was weather. The forecast called for rain by the weekend, and wet. Corn was nearly worthless corn. Every day they couldn't harvest was money flowing out of their pockets like water through a broken dam. By mid-morning, Rebecca had made a decision that would test the boundaries of their partnership. She bundled the girls into the pickup truck and drove out to the field where Jacob was working, parking at the edge of the rows where she could flag him down. "What's wrong?" Jacob called out as he climbed down from the cab, his face already streaked with sweat and grain dust. "Nothing's wrong," Rebecca replied, "but we need to talk about efficiency." Jacob looked puzzled as Rebecca spread out a hand-drawn diagram on the truck's tailgate. She'd been studying his harvesting pattern and the field layout, applying the same analytical skills she'd once used to optimize office workflows. "You're harvesting in straight lines, field by field," Rebecca explained, pointing to her sketch. "But look, if you harvest in a spiral pattern starting from the outside edges, you can eliminate all these turns and save maybe 20 minutes per field." Jacob studied her diagram, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to admiration. "You're right. I've been doing it the way my father taught me, but his way was designed for smaller equipment." "There's more," Rebecca continued. "The girls and I could run grain to the elevator while you keep harvesting. Every time you stop to unload, that's 45 minutes of lost cutting time." The suggestion was practical but risky. It meant trusting Rebecca to handle grain sales, negotiations that could make the difference between profit and loss. It also meant splitting up their newly formed team during the most critical period of the farm's year. "You don't know the grain buyers," Jacob pointed out. "They're not exactly famous for their generosity with inexperienced sellers." "Then teach me," Rebecca said simply. "Right now. Tell me everything I need to know about moisture content, test weights, and market prices. I learn fast, and we don't have time for training wheels." The next hour became an intensive course in agricultural commerce, conducted in a cornfield, while 3 preschoolers played elaborate games of hide-and-seek among the corn stalks. Jacob explained the intricacies of grain grading, the importance of moisture levels, and the art of negotiating with elevator operators who had been buying corn since before Rebecca was born. "Most importantly," Jacob said, "don't let them intimidate you. Bill Henderson, who runs the elevator, is fair, but he'll test you. If he thinks you don't know what you're talking about, he'll try to shortchange you on the grade or the price." "Let me guess," Rebecca said dryly. "He's not used to dealing with women, especially women with Hispanic surnames and 3 children in tow." Jacob's expression confirmed her suspicions. Cedar Valley isn't exactly famous for its diversity. You might face some assumptions. Rebecca thought about Richard Blackwood's condescending tone, about the look she'd received in town, about the casual prejudice she'd encountered during her weeks of homelessness. "I've dealt with assumptions before. The question is whether you trust me to represent this farm properly." Jacob looked at this woman who'd appeared in his barn less than a week ago and had already saved his harvest through sheer determination and mechanical skill. "I trust you completely." The first grain run to the elevator became a test of everything Rebecca had learned about both agriculture and asserting herself in male-dominated environments. The girls sat in the truck's cab while Rebecca backed the grain trailer up to the elevator's receiving pit, a maneuver that required precision and confidence. Bill Henderson emerged from the elevator office like a sheriff investigating a disturbance. He was a short, stocky man in his 60s, with the suspicious expression of someone who'd been buying grain for 40 years and thought he'd seen every type of customer. "You're not Jacob Thompson," Henderson observed, looking from Rebecca to the girls to the Thompson Farm logo on the truck. "No, I'm Rebecca Martinez, Mr. Thompson's partner. We're delivering the first load from the North 40. Henderson's eyebrows rose at the word partner, and Rebecca could see him processing this unexpected development. "Partner, huh? Well, let's see what you've brought me." The grain inspection process was deliberately intimidating, designed to establish Henderson's expertise and the seller's dependence on his judgment. He tested moisture content, examined kernel quality, and made notes on a clipboard with the theatrical precision of a wine expert evaluating vintage Bordeaux. "Moisture's running a little high," Henderson announced. 22%. That's going to cost you." Rebecca had been prepared for this moment. "Actually, Mr. Henderson, I show 21.4% on our moisture meter. Would you mind running it again?" Henderson's surprise was obvious. Most farmers accepted his initial readings without question, trusting his experience over their own measurements. But Rebecca had tested the grain herself before leaving the farm, using Jacob's equipment to verify the numbers. "Your meter might be off," Henderson suggested, but he ran the test again. 21.6, still high." "Still within standard deviation of our reading," Rebecca replied pleasantly, "and well within the premium grade category according to current USDA standards." The negotiation continued for another 10 minutes, with Henderson testing Rebecca's knowledge of grain standards and market conditions while she calmly cited facts and figures Jacob had taught her. By the end, Henderson was looking at her with something approaching respect. "You know your business," he admitted, as he calculated the final settlement. "Thompson's lucky to have someone who understands the numbers." "Mr. Thompson and I are lucky to have each other," Rebecca corrected gently. The drive back to the farm was triumphant. Elena, Sophia, and Maria had watched their mother hold her own in a business negotiation, learning lessons about confidence and preparation that would serve them well in their own futures. "Mama, you were very brave with that man," Elena observed from her car seat. "Not brave, Mija, just prepared. Papa always said that knowledge was the best weapon against people who wanted to take advantage of you." Back at the farm, Jacob was waiting anxiously for news of the grain sale. When Rebecca handed him the settlement check, his expression shifted from relief to amazement. "This is 15% higher than Henderson usually pays," Jacob said, studying the figures. "How did you manage that?" "By knowing exactly what our grain was worth and not accepting anything less," Rebecca replied. "Also by making it clear that I wasn't intimidated by his testing routine. The pattern established that first day would continue for the next 2 weeks." Jacob harvested with methodical efficiency while Rebecca ran grain to the elevator, each building her reputation as a knowledgeable negotiator who couldn't be easily deceived or intimidated. The girls became fixtures at the grain elevator, charming the workers and learning about agriculture from an entirely different perspective. But success brought new challenges. Word of the Thompson Farm's improved operation had spread throughout Cedar Valley, attracting attention from both supporters and detractors. Some neighbors offered genuine congratulations and assistance. Others seemed resentful that an outsider was helping one of their local farmers succeed where he'd previously struggled. The tension came to a head during Rebecca's 5th trip to the grain elevator when she encountered Marcus Webb, a large-scale farmer who'd been hoping to acquire Thompson land for his own expansion plans. Webb had clearly been drinking, and his hostility was immediate and personal, So you're the Mexican woman who's got old Jacob thinking he can compete with real farmers, Webb said loudly enough for everyone in the elevator office to hear. Rebecca felt every eye in the building focus on her, waiting to see how she'd respond to the obvious provocation. The girls were in the truck outside, and she was acutely aware that her reaction would reflect not just on herself, but on Jacob and their partnership. "I'm Rebecca Martinez," she said calmly, "Mr. Thompson's business partner, and you are Marcus Webb. I run a serious operation, not some charity case playing at farming." The insult was designed to diminish both Rebecca's contributions and Jacob's judgment. But Rebecca had learned something important during her weeks of desperation. People who attacked you publicly were usually afraid of you privately. "Mr. Webb," she said pleasantly, "I understand you're interested in acquiring farmland in this area. Perhaps you should focus on improving your own yields instead of criticizing other people's success." It was a polite way of suggesting that Webb's hostile interest in their operation stemmed from professional jealousy rather than genuine concern. The implied criticism hit its mark, and Webb's face reddened with anger. "Listen here, lady." "Mrs. Martinez," Rebecca corrected firmly, "and I think this conversation is over." She completed her business with Bill Henderson while Webb glowered from across the office, then collected her settlement and walked calmly to the truck. Only when she was safely behind the wheel did she allow her hands to shake with the adrenaline of confronting someone who clearly wished her harm. "Mama, was that man angry at you?" Sophia asked from the back seat. "Some people get angry when other people succeed," Rebecca explained carefully. "It's not about us, it's about them being unhappy with themselves." That evening, as they reviewed the day's progress over dinner, Rebecca told Jacob about her encounter with Marcus Webb. Jacob's expression grew increasingly grim as she described the confrontation. "Webb's been trying to buy my land for 3 years, Jacob said. "He's not going to be happy that we're making this operation profitable." "Should I be worried about him?" Jacob considered the question seriously. "Webb's a bully, but he's not stupid. He won't do anything that could be traced back to him. But yes, I'd be careful. Success has made us visible, and not everyone wants us to succeed." As if to underscore Jacob's warning, they were interrupted by the sound of vehicles in the farmyard. Through the kitchen window they could see the flashing lights of a sheriff's deputy's patrol car, followed by a white sedan that Rebecca didn't recognize. "What now?" Jacob muttered, wiping his hands and heading for the front door. The deputy was young and professional, clearly uncomfortable with whatever mission had brought him to the Thompson farm. The man in the sedan introduced himself as Carl Peterson from the County Child Welfare Office, and Rebecca's blood turned to ice. "Ma'am," Peterson said to Rebecca, "we've received a complaint about the living conditions and supervision of the children residing at this address. I'm here to conduct a welfare check." Rebecca felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Someone had called child services, trying to use her daughters as weapons against their newfound stability. The battle for their future was about to take a turn that would test everything they'd built together. Carl Peterson's clipboard held the power to destroy everything Rebecca had built for her daughters in less than a week. As the child welfare investigator followed them into the farmhouse, Rebecca's mind raced through every possible vulnerability someone could exploit. The girls' recent homelessness, their unconventional living situation, the speed with which they'd moved in with a virtual stranger. "This is a beautiful home," Peterson observed, his tone professionally neutral as he surveyed the living room. His eyes catalogued details. The children's toys scattered across the coffee table, the family, photos on the mantelpiece, the general cleanliness and warmth of the space. "Thank you," Rebecca replied carefully, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The girls have been very happy here." Elena, Sophia, and Maria had gathered near the staircase, their expressions reflecting the tension they sensed, but couldn't fully understand. Rebecca's instinct was to gather them close, but she knew that any sign of anxiety might be interpreted as evidence of guilt. "Mr. Thompson," Peterson said, addressing Jacob directly, "I understand you've recently taken in Ms. Martinez and her children. Can you tell me about the circumstances of that arrangement?" Jacob's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Rebecca and her daughters needed a place to stay, and I needed help with the farm. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement." "And how long have you known Ms. Martinez?" "About 10 days, Jacob admitted, and Rebecca saw Peterson make a note on his clipboard. The admission sounded damning when stated so boldly. 10 days between first meeting and moving 3 children into a stranger's home would raise red flags for any child welfare worker, no matter how reasonable the circumstances had been. "Ms. Martinez," Peterson continued, "I'm required to ask about your employment history, your current financial situation, and the stability of your housing arrangement." Rebecca had prepared for this moment during the drive home from the grain elevator, knowing instinctively that someone would try to use the system against them. "I was employed in data management in Minneapolis until my pregnancy with the girls required bed rest. After my husband Miguel died 6 months ago, I lost our home due to medical debt. Mr. Thompson and I have formed a business partnership that provides both housing and income." "A business partnership," Peterson repeated, making another note. "Can you document this arrangement?" Jacob stepped forward, pulling a folded paper from his shirt pocket. "Partnership agreement, signed and notarized yesterday. Rebecca is a full partner in Thompson Farm operations, with equal decision-making authority and profit sharing." Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude toward Jacob for his foresight. During their busy harvest days, he'd somehow found time to visit the bank and create legal documentation that legitimized their arrangement in the eyes of the law. Peterson examined the document carefully, his expression revealing surprise at its thoroughness. "This appears to be comprehensive. However, I still need to assess the living conditions and interview the children privately." The house tour that followed was both vindication and torture. Peterson examined every room with clinical attention to detail, checking for safety hazards, adequate space, and signs of neglect or abuse. The girls' bedroom passed inspection easily. It was clean, well organized, and filled with the small touches that made it clearly theirs. "The children appear well cared for," Peterson admitted as they returned to the living room. "Now I need to speak with each of them individually." Rebecca's hands clenched into fists, but she nodded. She'd prepared the girls for this possibility, teaching them to answer questions honestly, but without volunteering unnecessary information that could be misinterpreted. Elena went first, her natural confidence serving her well as Peterson asked about her daily routine, her feelings about living at the farm, and her relationship with Jacob. Rebecca could hear fragments of the conversation from the kitchen, where she waited with Sophia and Maria. "Mr. Jacob is very nice," Elena's clear voice carried through the thin walls. "He teaches us about the animals, and he listens when we tell him things. Mama is much happier here than when we lived in the car." Rebecca winced at Elena's casual mention of their homelessness, though she knew it was better to acknowledge their past circumstances than to try hiding them. Sophia's interview followed, a similar pattern, though her responses were more emotional. "I like it here because Mama doesn't cry at night anymore," Sophia told Peterson, "and there's food in the refrigerator all the time, so we don't have to be hungry." Maria, the youngest, provided the most heartbreaking testimony. When Peterson asked if she felt safe at the farm, Maria nodded vigorously. "Mr. Jacob fixed the big machine that was sick, and now it makes happy noises. Mama says when you help sick things feel better, that makes you a good person." After completing the individual interviews, Peterson called Rebecca and Jacob back into the living room. The deputy had remained silent throughout the process, but Rebecca could see sympathy in his expression. "I want to be clear about something," Peterson began. "The complaint I received alleged that these children were living in unsafe conditions with inadequate supervision. Based on my observation, those allegations are completely unfounded." Rebecca felt her knees weaken with relief, but Peterson wasn't finished. "However, I am required to file a report detailing the rapid changes in the children's living situation. While I see no immediate safety concerns, the department will likely schedule follow-up visits to ensure stability." "What does that mean for us?" Jacob asked. "It means someone will be watching," Peterson replied honestly. "Whoever filed this complaint isn't going to be satisfied with my findings. They may try again, possibly with different allegations." The deputy spoke up for the first time. "Mr. Thompson, do you have any idea who might have made this complaint?" Jacob and Rebecca exchanged glances. The list of people who might want to disrupt their partnership was growing, but they had no proof of anyone's involvement. "We've had some business conflicts recently," Jacob said carefully. "People who aren't happy about our success." After the officials left, Rebecca sat on the front porch steps, watching her daughters play in the yard, while Jacob finished his evening farm chores. The relief of surviving the welfare check was tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning of their legal challenges. "They'll be back," Rebecca said when Jacob joined her on the porch. "Probably, but Peterson seemed fair, and the girls did great in their interviews." "Elena mentioned living in the car," Rebecca said with a bitter laugh. "Sophia talked about me crying at night. They're too young to understand how their honesty could be used against us." Jacob was quiet for a moment, watching Elena teach her sisters a clapping game she'd learned from Sarah before her death. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe honesty is exactly what we need. Honesty doesn't always win against people with money and influence. "No," Jacob agreed, "but lies always lose eventually. We're not doing anything wrong, Rebecca. We're taking care of each other, building something good, giving your girls a stable home. That has to count for something." The next morning brought unexpected support from a source neither of them had anticipated. Dr. Patricia Henley, the pediatrician who had examined the girls during their initial health check, arrived unannounced with a folder full of documentation. "I heard about yesterday's visit," Dr. Henley said without preamble. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed for your files." She handed Rebecca a comprehensive medical report detailing the girls' excellent health, their appropriate development, and the clear evidence of consistent, loving care. More importantly, the report documented their condition when Rebecca first brought them in: malnourished, stressed, but showing no signs of abuse or neglect. "Between you and me," Dr. Henley said quietly, "those children have thrived since coming here. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." "Why are you helping us?" Rebecca asked. Dr. Henley's expression grew serious. "Because I've seen what happens when good families get torn apart by people with agendas. Your girls are lucky to have you, and this community is lucky to have families like yours." The support continued throughout the week as harvest operations resumed. Sarah's sister, Margaret, whom Jacob hadn't spoken to since the funeral, arrived with a casserole and an offer to babysit. Bill Henderson from the grain elevator stopped by to tell Jacob that Rebecca's negotiation skills had impressed several other farmers. Even Pete Morrison from the garage called to say he'd heard good things about their partnership. But the most meaningful support came from an unexpected source. On Friday afternoon, as Rebecca was preparing for another grain run, a caravan of pickup trucks pulled into the farmyard. 8 neighboring farmers had arrived with their own equipment, ready to help finish the Thompson harvest in a single day. "Heard you might need some help getting this crop in before the weather turns," said Tom Bradley, a veteran farmer whose land bordered Jacob's property. Rebecca felt tears spring to her eyes as she watched the community mobilize around their success. These were people who understood farming, who recognized the value of hard work and mutual support. Jacob was nearly speechless. "Tom, I can't afford to pay crews." "Who said anything about pay?" Bradley replied with a grin. "We're neighbors. Neighbors. Help neighbors." What followed was a harvesting operation that would become legendary in Cedar Valley's farming community. 9 combines worked in coordinated precision, cutting corn with an efficiency that transformed the impossible timeline into manageable reality. Rebecca coordinated grain transport with military precision, running constant shuttles to the elevator while the girls rode along, wide-eyed at the scale of community cooperation. By sunset, the Thompson farm's entire corn crop had been harvested, processed, and sold. The financial numbers were better than Jacob's most optimistic projections, enough to pay the bank, upgrade equipment, and provide security for Rebecca and the girls through the winter months. But more than financial success, the day had demonstrated something that would prove crucial in the battles to come. The community had chosen sides. The families who mattered, the people who understood what farming and family really meant, had declared their support for the unlikely partnership between a struggling widower and a homeless mother with 3 small children. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table, calculating profits and planning for spring planting, Elena asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. "Mama, are we going to stay here forever now?" Rebecca looked at Jacob, who nodded encouragingly. For the first time since Miguel's death, she felt ready to make promises about the future. "Yes, mija, we're home." Outside, the empty cornfields stretched under starlight, waiting for spring and new possibilities. Inside the Thompson farmhouse, a family that had found each other against all odds settled in for the night, secure in the knowledge that they'd proven their worth to the only people whose opinions truly mattered. The child welfare investigation had been meant to divide them. Instead, it had revealed the strength of their foundation and the depth of their community support. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as partners, as family, as people who understood that sometimes the most unlikely combinations created the strongest bonds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were simply a family grateful for everything they'd built together. December in Iowa brought snow that transformed the Thompson farm into a crystalline wonderland that delighted the girls and challenged the adults in equal measure. For Elena, Sophia, and Maria, this was their first real winter. Their previous December had been spent in Minneapolis shelters and the cramped confines of their failing Honda. Now they had space to build snowmen, engage in epic snowball fights, and discover the magical transformation that winter brought to rural landscapes. For Rebecca and Jacob, winter meant a different kind of test. The successful harvest had secured their financial foundation, but it had also attracted renewed attention from forces determined to see their partnership fail. The challenge now wasn't survival. It was building something sustainable enough to withstand whatever storms lay ahead. The first storm came in the form of a legal notice delivered by certified mail on a Tuesday morning when the girls were helping Jacob feed the cattle. Rebecca signed for the envelope with growing dread, recognizing the return address of a law firm she'd never heard of, but whose letterhead screamed expensive representation. "Notice of paternity challenge and custody investigation," Rebecca read aloud, her voice barely steady. The document was dense with legal language, but its meaning was crystal clear. Someone was claiming that Miguel Martinez was not the biological father of her daughters, and therefore questioning Rebecca's legal authority over them. Jacob found her at the kitchen table 20 minutes later, still staring at the papers as if they might transform into something less threatening through sheer force of will. "What is it?" he asked, noting her pale complexion and trembling hands. Rebecca handed him the notice without speaking. Jacob read it twice, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. "This is insane," he said finally. "Miguel was their father. You were married. There are birth certificates, medical records, school enrollment forms, all of which can be challenged if someone has enough money and motivation, Rebecca interrupted. The notice says they've identified a potential biological father who's demanding DNA testing and custody rights. The cruelty of the attack was breathtaking in its precision. Someone had researched Rebecca's history thoroughly enough to discover that Miguel hadn't met her until the girls were nearly 6 months old. While he'd legally adopted them and they'd lived as his daughters for their entire conscious lives, the biological reality was more complicated. "Who's filing this challenge?" Jacob asked, though they both suspected they knew. Rebecca checked the signature line. "The law firm represents someone named David Morrison. He claims to be the biological father and says he was never informed of the pregnancies or the births." Jacob's face went ashen. "Morrison, like Seth Morrison, the rancher from the original story, but this Morrison could be Marcus Webb using a false name or someone he's hired to front for him?" Rebecca finished. "The timing is too convenient to be coincidental." The legal challenge was a masterpiece of malicious strategy. Even if Rebecca ultimately won, the process would consume months and cost thousands of dollars they didn't have. During the investigation, her custody could be restricted, the girls could be placed in temporary care, and their entire family structure could be dismantled. But Rebecca Martinez had learned something important during her journey from homeless desperation to farming partnership. When someone tried to use your greatest vulnerabilities against you, the best defense was often complete transparency. "Jacob," she said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you about the girl's biological father." What followed was the most difficult conversation Rebecca had ever initiated. She told Jacob about her college relationship with David Morrison, a charming graduate student who disappeared when she told him about her pregnancy. She explained how Miguel had stepped in without hesitation, adopting the girls legally and emotionally, becoming the only father they'd ever known. "Miguel never cared about biology," Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. "He said love made families, not DNA. The girls don't even know he wasn't their biological father." Jacob listened without interruption, his expression revealing neither judgment nor surprise. When Rebecca finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Does this change how you feel about us?" Rebecca asked, unable to keep the vulnerability out of her voice. "Rebecca," Jacob said gently, "I fell in love with 3 little girls who call me Mr. Jacob and help me feed the chickens. I fell in love with a woman who saved my farm and taught me what partnership really means. Biology doesn't change any of that." The relief that flooded through Rebecca was so intense it left her dizzy, but Jacob wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "we need to fight this challenge with everything we have. Those girls belong with you, regardless of who contributed genetic material." The battle that followed would test every relationship Rebecca and Jacob had built. In Cedar Valley, their first stop was the law office of Patricia Wells, the only family attorney within 50 miles who had experience with custody challenges. Wells was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who listened to their story with professional attention. "The challenge is weak legally, but strong strategically," Wells explained after reviewing the documents. "Mr. Morrison, if that's even his real name, waited over 3 years to assert parental rights. Any decent judge will question why he's suddenly interested in children he's never supported or contacted. But the investigation could still disrupt our family," Rebecca said. "Absolutely, that's the point. This isn't about winning custody. It's about making your life difficult enough that you give up and leave town." Wells outlined a defense strategy that would require Rebecca to prove not just Miguel's paternal relationship to the girls, but also the stability and appropriateness of their current living situation. Every aspect of their life would be scrutinized, from their financial arrangement to their sleeping arrangements to the girls' educational and emotional development. "I'll need character witnesses," Wells explained. "People who can testify to your parenting abilities and the girls' well-being, preferably long-term residents of the community whose word carries weight." Rebecca felt despair creeping in. They'd been in Cedar Valley for less than 3 months. Their strongest relationships were business-based, and their closest allies were other farmers who might be reluctant to get involved in legal disputes. But Jacob was already thinking strategically. Dr. Henley will testify about the girls' health and development. Tom Bradley has grandchildren the same age. He can speak to Rebecca's parenting skills. And Sarah's sister Margaret has been helping with childcare. She's lived here her whole life. The next weeks became a crash course in small-town legal warfare. Rebecca found herself documenting every aspect of their daily routine, collecting school records from Minneapolis, and gathering testimonials from everyone who'd witnessed her interactions with the girls. The process revealed the depth of support they'd built in their short time in Cedar Valley. Bill Henderson from the grain elevator provided a written statement about Rebecca's business acumen and integrity. The pastor of the local Methodist church, whom they'd met only once, offered to testify about their family's integration into the community. Even Pete Morrison from the garage volunteered to speak about Rebecca's mechanical skills and work ethic. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Elena, Sophia, and Maria, despite their young age, would be interviewed by a court-appointed child advocate whose report would carry significant weight in any custody decision. Dr. Jennifer Ramos, the child advocate, was a bilingual psychologist from Des Moines who specialized in custody evaluations. Her assessment process was gentle but thorough, involving play therapy sessions, family observation, and individual interviews designed to determine the girl's emotional state and preferences. Rebecca watched through one-way glass as Dr. Ramos worked with each daughter individually. Elena, as the oldest, was the most articulate about her feelings. "I like living at the farm," Elena told Dr. Ramos. "Mama doesn't worry all the time anymore. And Mr. Jacob teaches us about animals. When Papa died, everything was scary. Now things feel safe again." Sophia's interview focused more on her emotional security. "I have my own bed, and there's always food, and Mama tucks us in every night. Mr. Jacob reads us stories sometimes, and he knows all the voices for different characters." Maria, the youngest, provided the most heartbreaking testimony. When Dr. Ramos asked if she missed her old home, Maria shook her head emphatically. "This is home. Mama smiles here. Mr. Jacob fixed the big machine, and now everything works again." The girls' clear preference for their current situation was powerful evidence, but Dr. Ramos also evaluated their relationship with Rebecca and Jacob as potential co-parents. Her observations during family dinner time, bedtime routines, and problem-solving sessions revealed a family unit that functioned with remarkable harmony considering its recent formation. The children demonstrate secure attachment to both Ms. Martinez and Mr. Thompson, Dr. Ramos noted in her preliminary report. They've developed age-appropriate relationships with Mr. Thompson that suggest successful blended family integration. While the legal process continued, life on the farm developed its own winter rhythms. The girls learned to help with indoor farm chores, sorting seeds for spring planting, organizing tools in the workshop, and helping Rebecca with the detailed record-keeping that modern farming required. Jacob began teaching them basic mechanical skills, carrying on the tradition Miguel had started. "Papa used to say tools were like magic wands," Elena reminded him one afternoon as they worked on a small engine repair project. "Your papa was right," Jacob agreed. "But the real magic isn't in the tools, it's in the person using them." The conversation that followed revealed how naturally Jacob had assumed a paternal role in their lives. He wasn't trying to replace Miguel. No one could do that. Instead, he was becoming something new, a stable male presence who could teach them skills, provide emotional security, and demonstrate through daily actions what commitment looked like. Rebecca watched these interactions with growing amazement. Jacob had never had children of his own, yet he seemed to instinctively understand what Eleanor, Sophia, and Maria needed. He was patient with their questions, gentle with their mistakes, and consistent in his affection. One evening in late December, as they sat around the kitchen table working on a jigsaw puzzle that had become their winter project, Elena asked the question that had been building for weeks. "Mr. Jacob, are you going to be our new papa?" The question hung in the air, like smoke from the fireplace. Rebecca felt her heart stop as she waited for Jacob's response, knowing that his answer would define their family's future. Jacob set down his puzzle piece and looked at each girl in turn. "Elena, Sophia, Maria, you had a wonderful papa who loved you very much. Miguel will always be your papa, and no one can ever change that." The girls nodded solemnly, understanding the importance of honoring Miguel's memory. "But," Jacob continued, "if your mama says it's okay, I would be honored to be your second papa. Families can have more than one papa, especially when the first papa would want someone to take care of his girls." Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face as Elena, Sophia, and Maria looked at her expectantly. "Is it okay, Mama?" Sophia asked. "Can Mr. Jacob be our second papa?" "Yes, mijas," Rebecca whispered. "I think Papa Miguel would be very happy about that." The legal challenge was still pending. Winter was far from over, and they had no guarantee that their enemies wouldn't find new ways to attack their family. But in that moment, around a kitchen table covered with puzzle pieces and surrounded by the warm glow of domestic happiness, Rebecca Martinez knew that they'd built something stronger than legal documents or biological relationships. They'd built a family based on choice, commitment, and love, the kind of family that could weather any storm. Spring arrived early in Cedar Valley, bringing with it the kind of hope that farmers understand in their bones, the promise of new growth, fresh starts, and the eternal cycle of planting and harvest. For the Thompson-Martinez family, as they'd begun calling themselves, spring also brought the resolution of battles that had tested their strength throughout the long winter months. The custody challenge that had threatened to tear their family apart crumbled spectacularly in late March, when Patricia Wells discovered that David Morrison was indeed a fabrication. The real biological father, David Chen, was a software engineer in Seattle who'd been happily married for 5 years and had no knowledge that his brief college relationship with Rebecca had resulted in children. More damning for the challengers, Chen had signed an affidavit stating he'd been contacted months earlier by someone offering to pay him to claim paternity, which he'd refused to do. The whole thing was a fraud, Wells explained, as she delivered the news to Rebecca and Jacob. Someone hired actors to file false documents, hoping to disrupt your custody long enough to force you out of town. The State Bar Association is investigating, and whoever orchestrated this could face criminal charges. Rebecca felt a mixture of relief and anger. Will we ever know who was behind it? The paper trail leads to a shell company that traces back to AgriCorp, Wells replied. But proving Richard Blackwood's personal involvement would be nearly impossible. Jacob's jaw tightened. So he gets away with trying to destroy our family. Not exactly, Wells said with a satisfied smile. The fraudulent legal challenge violated several federal laws. AgriCorp is facing a massive investigation that could cost them their agricultural subsidies throughout Iowa. Sometimes justice takes unexpected forms. The legal victory was sweet, but it paled in comparison to the personal triumph that came 2 weeks later. Jacob had been planning his proposal for months, consulting with Elena, Sophia, and Maria to ensure his approach honored both Miguel's memory and their future as a blended family. The proposal itself was perfectly suited to their unconventional beginning. Jacob arranged it in the barn, where they'd first met, but the dingy hayloft had been transformed into something magical. Strings of lights created a warm glow, while photos of Miguel and Sarah were arranged alongside pictures of their new family adventures. The girls had helped create decorations, and their handwritten signs declared their excitement about becoming officially a family. "Rebecca Martinez," Jacob said, as they stood surrounded by memories of loss and hope. "9 months ago, I thought. My life was ending. You and your daughters saved me in ways I'm still discovering. Will you marry me and make this family official?" Rebecca's yes was barely audible through her tears, but the girls' cheering could probably be heard 3 farms over. The ring Jacob offered wasn't expensive, a simple band that had belonged to his grandmother, but Rebecca treasured it more than any diamond because it represented choice, commitment, and the courage to build something beautiful from broken pieces. The wedding, held in June on the farm itself, became a celebration that drew the entire Cedar Valley community. Tom Bradley and his wife hosted the reception in their barn, while Dr. Henley served as Rebecca's matron of honor, and Bill Henderson gave Jacob advice about marriage that was only slightly more helpful than his grain-buying tips. Elena, Sophia, and Maria served as flower girls, but their most important role came during the ceremony itself. After Jacob and Rebecca exchanged vows, the girls participated in a unity ceremony where they helped plant a tree that would grow alongside their family. Each girl placed soil around the young oak's roots while promising to help it grow strong and tall. "This tree will be here long after we're gone," Jacob told them. "Just like the love we're planting today will keep growing even when we can't see it anymore." The reception revealed how completely the Thompson-Martinez family had been accepted into the fabric of their community. Neighboring farmers brought gifts of tools and equipment that would help them expand their operation. The Methodist Church ladies presented Rebecca with a cookbook filled with family recipes and personal notes, welcoming her officially into their circle. Even Pete Morrison from the garage contributed a rebuilt transmission for their aging pickup truck. But the most meaningful gift came from an unexpected source. Carl Peterson, the child welfare investigator who'd once threatened their family's stability, approached Rebecca during the reception with an envelope. "I wanted you to have this," Peterson said, his usual professional demeanor softened by genuine warmth. "It's a copy of my final report on your family's case." Rebecca opened the envelope to find a document that read like a love letter to their unconventional success. Peterson had detailed the girls' remarkable progress, their obvious security and happiness, and the extraordinary partnership that had transformed a failing farm into a thriving operation. In 20 years of child welfare work, Peterson had written, "I have rarely observed a family unit that demonstrates such clear evidence of love, stability, and mutual support." The Thompson-Martinez family serves as an example of how non-traditional families can provide exceptional care and emotional security for children. "Thank you," Rebecca whispered, clutching the report that would serve as insurance against any future challenges to their family's legitimacy. As the celebration continued into the evening, Rebecca found herself standing apart from the crowd, watching Jacob teach Elena and Sophia to dance while Maria dozed in Margaret's arms. The transformation in all their lives was so complete it sometimes felt surreal. A year ago, she'd been a desperate woman, sleeping in a broken car with 3 hungry children, facing a future that seemed to offer nothing but struggle and uncertainty. Tonight, She was a business owner, a valued community member, and most importantly, a woman who'd learned that love could rebuild lives more efficiently than any government program or charitable organization. Jacob caught her eye across the dance floor and smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features into something that took her breath away. This man who'd risked everything to help a family of strangers had become her anchor, her partner, and her proof that kindness was the most powerful force in the universe. The party gradually wound down as families collected sleeping children and elderly neighbors made their way home before full darkness fell. But the Thompson-Martinez family wasn't ready for the celebration to end. They gathered on their front porch, still dressed in their wedding finery, to watch the stars emerge over their valley. "Tell us the story again," Elena requested, settling. Between Jacob and Rebecca on the porch swing, they'd installed the previous month. "Which story?" Rebecca asked, though she knew exactly what Elena meant. "The story about how you found us," Sophia clarified from her perch on Jacob's lap. It had become a family tradition, this retelling of their origin story. But each version grew richer with details and perspective, transforming from a tale of desperation into an epic of courage, partnership, and love. "Once upon a time," Rebecca began, "there was a farmer who was very sad because his farm was sick, and he didn't know how to make it better. And there was a mama with 3 little girls who were very hungry because they didn't have a home," Eleanor continued, taking up her part of the story. "But the farmer had a good heart," Jacob added, "and when he found the mama and her daughters sleeping in his barn, he knew that helping them was more important than being afraid. And the mama was very smart," Sophia chimed in, "and she knew how to fix the big machine that was broken. And everyone worked together," Maria mumbled sleepily, "and made everything better." Rebecca smiled as she listened to their collective narrative, noting how the story had evolved to emphasize cooperation over individual heroism, partnership over rescue, and choice over circumstance. These weren't passive victims who'd been saved by a benevolent stranger. They were active participants who'd all contributed to their mutual salvation. "And then what happened?" Rebecca prompted, even though they all knew the ending. "They became a real family," all 3 girls said in unison, "and they lived happily ever after." "Not ever after," Jacob corrected gently, "happily ever working. Because families aren't fairy tales. They're daily choices to love each other, even when it's hard." As the evening deepened and the girls finally succumbed to exhaustion, Rebecca and Jacob carried them upstairs to beds that had become completely, unquestionably theirs. Elena's room was filled with books about farming and mechanical engineering. Sophia's space overflowed with art supplies and half-finished projects. Maria's domain was ruled by stuffed animals and the elaborate dollhouse Jacob had built during the long winter evenings. "They're really ours now," Rebecca whispered as they stood in the hallway outside the girls' rooms. "They were always ours," Jacob replied. "The wedding just made it official for everyone else." Downstairs, Rebecca changed out of her wedding dress and into comfortable clothes, while Jacob performed his nightly check of the farm buildings. When he returned, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers, agricultural journals, equipment catalogues, and expansion plans that represented their dreams for the future. "What are you reading?" Jacob asked, settling beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "Plans," Rebecca replied, showing him a detailed proposal for diversifying their operation to include organic vegetables and a small farmer's market stand. "I've been thinking about ways to make the farm more profitable and sustainable." Jacob studied her plans with growing excitement. Rebecca had outlined a 5-year growth strategy that would triple their income while creating jobs for other community members. Her business acumen, combined with their proven agricultural partnership, could transform their small family farm into a regional success story. "This is ambitious," Jacob said. "We've already proved that ambitious works for us," as they discussed Rebecca's expansion plans. Both of them were acutely aware of how far they'd traveled from that desperate night when she'd begged him not to hurt her and her children. They'd built something that neither could have imagined alone, a partnership based on mutual respect, a family bound by choice rather than biology, and a business that proved love could be just as practical as it was transformative. "Jacob," Rebecca said as they prepared for bed, in the master bedroom they now shared, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't gone to the barn that night?" Jacob considered the question seriously. "I think you would have found another way to save your girls. You're the strongest person I've ever met." "Strength is easier when you're not alone," Rebecca replied. "Miguel taught me that, but you proved it." Outside their bedroom window, the farm stretched out under starlight, fields ready for spring planting, buildings maintained with pride, and livestock that represented financial security they'd earned together. In the distance, the barn where they'd first met stood as a monument to the power of extending kindness to strangers. As Rebecca drifted off to sleep beside the man who'd become her partner in every sense of the word, she thought about Eleanor's favorite part of their origin story, the moment when the farmer chose to help instead of turning away. That single decision had created ripple effects that transformed 5 lives, strengthened an entire community, and proved that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships produce the most extraordinary results. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and the daily work of sustaining what they'd built together. But tonight, in a farmhouse that rang with children's laughter and the contentment of hard work, fairly rewarded, the Thompson-Martinez family rested in the knowledge that they'd gotten the most important thing right. They'd learned that home wasn't a place. It was people who chose to build something beautiful together, one day at a time, with courage, commitment, and the radical belief that love could indeed conquer all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.